Something is running on your Linux system at this exact moment, whose presence, the terminal, whose output this examination is going to walk you through, will confirm as the activity that the comfortable assumption of the Linux platform's inherent security, whose widespread acceptance in the Linux community, has been preventing the routine verification that the assumption's accuracy requires from being performed with the regularity that the assumption's validation demands as the basic security hygiene whose absence the comfortable assumption has been substituting for, with the belief that the Linux platform's architectural superiority over the Windows platform's security model makes the active monitoring unnecessary for the Linux user whose platform choice the security improvement motivated. That assumption is the assumption whose dangerous inaccuracy this examination is correcting, because the correction is the contribution that the Linux user whose system's actual security state the assumption has been obscuring deserves as the honest security education that the Linux community's tendency to conflate the platform's architectural security advantages with the individual system's operational security has been failing to provide with the specificity and the urgency that the actual threat landscape's current state demands. Your Linux system is not automatically secure because it runs Linux. Your Linux system is secure to the degree that the configuration, the monitoring, the update discipline, and the access control, whose implementation the system's security requires, have been implemented with the thoroughness that the security's maintenance demands as the ongoing operational practice, rather than the one-time installation decision, whose completion the secure system's continued security guarantees without the ongoing practice's continuation. The Linux platform's architectural security advantages are real and are the genuine improvements over the Windows security model that the honest comparison confirms. The architectural security advantages are not the substitute for the operational security practices whose absence leaves the architecturally superior platform's individual installation vulnerable to the specific attack vectors whose exploitation the architectural advantages do not prevent, when the operational practices whose implementation the architectural advantages enable but do not replace have not been implemented. Here is what is potentially running on your system right now, and here is exactly how you check each one with the specific terminal commands whose output the checking requires interpreting, with the understanding that this examination is providing alongside the commands because the command's output without the interpretation's guidance produces the data whose significance the Linux user whose security monitoring experience is limited cannot assess with the accuracy that the security decision requires. The first thing you need to check is the process list, whose examination reveals the running processes whose presence on your system, the legitimate software's installation, explains as the expected processes and whose presence. The unexpected process, whose explanation the legitimate software's inventory does not provide, indicates as the suspicious activity whose further investigation the presence's discovery initiates, as the security response whose execution this examination is guiding. Open your terminal right now and run the command that shows you every single process running on your system with the user context whose identification reveals whether the process is running, with the root privileges whose acquisition the attacker, whose goal is the system's complete compromise, is attempting to achieve through the privilege escalation, whose detection the process lists. Examination enables when the examination identifies the unexpected process running with the root privileges whose legitimate explanation the system's software inventory does not provide. Type P as O and read the output with the attention to the processes whose names you do not recognize, whose paths are not the standard system paths, whose legitimacy the file system hierarchy standard establishes as the expected. Locations for the legitimate system processes, and whose resource consumption the CPU and memory columns reveal as the unusual consumption that the background surveillance process whose purpose is the data collection, rather than the user-requested computation exhibits as the behavioral signature that distinguishes it from the legitimate background processes, whose resource consumption the system's normal operation requires. The output you are looking at after running ps-aux is the complete picture of your system's current activity, whose examination is the first step in the security audit, that every Linux user should be performing regularly, but that the comfortable assumption of the Linux platform's inherent security has been preventing from being performed with the regularity that the system's actual security state's verification requires. Pay specific attention to the processes running under your username rather than the system usernames, because the attacker whose initial access to your system was achieved through the exploitation of your user account rather than the root account is running the surveillance process under your username, as the processes whose presence in the process list the user context makes less suspicious than the root-owned process, whose unexpected presence the security-conscious user notices immediately. The user-owned process, whose name resembles the legitimate system process name, but whose path is the home directory path, rather than the standard system path, is the process whose suspicious character the path examination reveals, when the name examination's result is the legitimate appearing name whose legitimacy the path examination disproves. The second thing you need to check immediately is the network connections, whose examination reveals the external communications that your system is currently maintaining with the remote addresses, whose identification reveals whether the communications are the expected communications that your legitimate software's network activity explains, or the unexpected communications that the surveillance process's data exfiltration activity maintains as the channel through which the collected data is being transmitted to the attacker's infrastructure. Run netstat minus toolnp or the ss minus toolnp command. If your system's netstat availability is limited by the nettools package's absence from the default installation, and examine the output with the attention to the established connections whose remote addresses the examination identifies as the destinations to which your system is currently sending data. Every established connection in this output represents a live channel between your system and a remote address, whose purpose, the connection's port number, the process identifier, whose network connection the process column identifies, and the remote. Address's reputation, whose assessment the threat intelligence lookup produces together, determine as the legitimate communication or the suspicious communication requiring the further investigation that the suspicious communication's presence initiates. The specific connection pattern that should alarm you immediately is the established connection to a remote address that no browser window, no application you consciously opened, and no system service whose network communication the system's legitimate operation requires explains as the source of the connection whose establishment you did not initiate through the deliberate application interaction that the legitimate connection's creation requires. This unexplained established connection is the connection that the background process, whose presence you may have identified in the process list examination or may be discovering for the first time in the network examination, is maintaining as the exfiltration channel whose traffic represents your system's data being transmitted to the location whose control belongs to the person whose presence on your system you did not authorize. The port number whose examination contributes to the connection's characterization as the suspicious connection rather than the legitimate connection is the port number that falls outside the standard service ports, whose assignment the well-known port registry establishes as the expected ports for the legitimate services, specifically the high-numbered ports, whose selection the attacker whose goal is the covert communication channels maintenance prefers, because the high-numbered ports traffic is the traffic that the basic firewall rule whose focus is the well-known ports does not inspect with the thoroughness that the well-known ports traffic receives. The third thing you need to check is the authentication log, whose examination reveals every login attempt, every successful authentication, and every failed authentication that your system has recorded since the log's last rotation. Because the authentication log is the record that the attacker whose access to your system was achieved through the brute force attack or the credential stuffing attack, whose execution the internet-facing SSH service, whose exposure to the public internet your system's network configuration may have created, left the evidence of in the failed authentication attempts, whose volume and origin the log's examination reveals as the attack's documentation. Run the command grep failed var log auth.log and examine the output, whose line count reveals whether the failed authentication attempts, whose presence in every internet-facing system's authentication log represents the normal background noise of the automated scanning whose targets include every IP address regardless of the system's content, or whose line count reveals the concentrated attack, whose temporal clustering and source address consistency indicate the targeted attack rather than the background scanning noise. The number that should concern you is not the presence of failed authentication attempts, because the failed authentication attempts are present in every internet-facing system's authentication log as the inevitable consequence of the automated scanning, whose coverage includes every publicly accessible IP address on the internet. The number that should concern you is the successful authentication, whose presence in the authentication log, following the failed authentication attempts, whose pattern indicates the brute force attack suggests that the brute force attack's eventual success produced the access, whose documentation, the successful authentication entry, represents. Find the successful authentication entries in your authentication log with the grep accepted var log auth.log command and examine the timestamps, the source addresses, and the usernames whose combination reveals whether the successful authentications represent your own login activity or the attacker's successful access, whose documentation in the log's honest recording preserved as the forensic evidence, whose examination the security check is recovering from the log file that the attacker, whose thoroughness includes the log deletion, would have removed if the detection's prevention required the evidence's destruction. The fourth thing you need to check is the scheduled tasks, whose examination reveals the persistence mechanisms that the attacker, whose initial access to your system has been, followed by the persistence establishment, whose purpose is the continued access maintenance after the initial access vector's closure. Run crontab -L to examine your user's crontab, and examine the pseudo crontab -L output to examine the root crontab, whose entries the attacker with root access would have modified, as the persistence mechanism, whose scheduled execution ensures the backdoor's reinstallation if the user's security response removes the backdoor's initial installation without removing the scheduled task whose execution reinstalls it. The crontab entry that should alarm you immediately is the entry whose command is the download and execution command that retrieves the script from a remote address and executes it on your system on the schedule that the cron timing expression specifies, because this entry is the classic persistence mechanism whose implementation requires the attacker to maintain only the remote script's availability as the backdoor reinstallation source, rather than the direct access whose interruption the security response produces. Examine also the system timer units, whose examination the systemctl list timers command produces as the complete list of the scheduled actions, whose implementation the modern Linux system's systemed architecture enables as the crontab alternative that the attacker familiar with the modern Linux systems architecture may have employed as the persistence mechanism, whose detection the crontab examination alone misses because the crontab examination's scope excludes the system timer units, whose separate examination the complete scheduled task audit requires. The system service unit, whose exec start directive contains the suspicious command, and whose timer unit schedules the suspicious command's execution on the interval that the persistence requirement specifies, is the persistence mechanism, whose discovery in the system timer examination constitutes the confirmation of the attacker's presence, and the persistence establishment, whose documentation the discovery provides as the forensic finding, whose remediation the security response requires, addressing before the cleanup's completion, leaves the persistence mechanism, whose reinstallation the cleanup's incompleteness enables. The fifth thing you need to check is the SUID binaries, whose presence on your system beyond the expected set that the standard system installation creates as the legitimate SUID binaries, whose elevated privilege execution the system's normal operation requires, represents the privilege escalation vector that the attacker whose initial access was achieved with the limited user privileges, whose escalation to the root privileges the SUID binary exploitation enables. Run the find command across your file system looking specifically for the files whose SUID permission bit setting makes them the privilege escalation candidates, whose unexpected presence indicates the attacker's privilege escalation preparation. The command find perm 4000 type F 2 dev null produces the complete list of the SUID binaries on your system, whose examination against the expected set that the standard installation creates reveals the unexpected SUID binary, whose presence indicates the attacker's modification of an existing binary's permissions or the placement of a new binary with the SUID permissions, whose exploitation the privilege escalation attack employs. The unexpected SUID binary is the finding that should produce the most urgent response in the security check, because the unexpected SUID binary's presence indicates not merely the surveillance activity whose cessation the process termination achieves, but the privilege escalation capability whose establishment the attacker has completed as the preparation for the root access that the SUID binary exploitation delivers when the attacker's access to the system resumes after the initial access session's conclusion. The attacker who has established the SUID binary persistence mechanism has prepared the capability for the complete system compromise, whose execution the next access session can complete with the root privileges whose acquisition the SUID binary exploitation provides as the escalation path from the limited user access to the unrestricted root access that the complete system compromise requires. The sixth thing you need to check is the recently modified files, whose examination the find command's time-based filtering produces as the list of the files modified within the time frame that the suspicious activity suspected initiation defines as the investigation's temporal scope. Run find, etc., bin, sbin, usr, bin, usr, sbin, and time -7 type F to find the files in the critical system, directories that have been modified within the last 7 days, and examine the list with the attention to the modifications that your own administrative activity does not explain as the expected changes whose source the administrative record confirms. The system binary whose modification timestamp falls within the investigation's temporal scope and whose modification your administrative activity does not explain is the potential Trojanized binary whose replacement of the legitimate binary, the attacker whose root access enabled the replacement performed as the persistence mechanism, whose sophistication exceeds the cron entry and the SUID binary, whose detection the standard checks produce because the Trojanized system binaries detection requires the integrity verification, whose implementation the file integrity monitoring system provides as the continuous monitoring capability. The file integrity monitoring system, whose installation the security conscious Linux administrator performs as the proactive security measure, rather than the reactive forensic investigation tool, is the monitoring capability, whose absence from the system, whose post-compromise examination this check is performing represents the monitoring gap, whose presence before the compromise would have detected the modification at the moment of its occurrence, rather than the investigation's initiation, whose timing the compromise's discovery determines as the retrospective examination rather than the real-time detection. Install 80 or tripwire after completing the security check as the file. Integrity monitoring system, whose database the clean system state populates as the baseline, whose subsequent comparison with the current state, the integrity check performs as the modification detection mechanism that alerts you to the unauthorized file modification at the moment of its occurrence, rather than the investigation's initiation, whose timing the compromise's eventual discovery determines. The honest reality about Linux security that this examination has been building toward, through the specific checks whose execution the examination has been guiding you through, is the reality that the Linux community's comfortable assumption of the platform's inherent security has been obscuring from the Linux user whose system's actual security, the assumption's accuracy, determines as the protected system or the compromised system, whose protection the assumption's comfortable acceptance substituted for the active security practice. Linux is architecturally more secure than Windows. The architectural security advantages are real, documented, and the genuine improvements that the honest comparison confirms as the Linux platform's security superiority over the Windows security model. The architectural security advantages do not make your specific Linux installation secure without the operational security practices, whose implementation this examination has been guiding you through, because the architectural advantage is the advantage of the platform's design and not the guarantee of the individual installation's security, whose maintenance the operational practice's ongoing execution produces. Your Linux system can be watched. Your Linux system can be compromised. Your Linux system's compromise leaves the evidence in the logs, the process list, the network connections, the scheduled tasks, the SUID, binaries, and the recently modified files whose examination the security check has been walking you through as the forensic investigation, whose execution produces the finding that either confirms the system's security or reveals the compromise, whose discovery the comfortable assumption of the inherent security was preventing from being made with the immediacy that the compromise's active exploitation demands, as the response whose urgency the ongoing data collection, whose cessation the detection enables. Run these checks now, not tomorrow. Not after finishing this video in the comfortable assumption that the checks can wait, because the Linux platform's architectural security makes the compromise unlikely enough that the check's urgency is the urgency of the theoretical risk rather than the practical threat. Run them now because the theoretical risk is the practical threat, whose manifestation the specific system's specific. Configurations specific vulnerabilities, whose exploitation the specific attacker's specific capability enables as the actual compromise, rather than the hypothetical scenario. The alert is real, the checks are available, the terminal is open, the commands are in this examination. The finding is one command. Away from the confirmation or the discovery whose implications for your system's security the finding's character determines as the continued operation or the incident response whose initiation the discovery demands. Check now. Because the watching, if it is happening, does not stop while you decide whether to look.